for 3 coffees. Yeah.
Well, it's the jump in people's mortgages.
Yep.
I mean, I know specifically one friend was talking to me about the jump in the various costs has taken their disposable income down to negative, just over a very short period.
Of course.
And what's going to happen is we're in this period now where recessionary pressures are hitting.
Yeah.
So there may be a desire to reduce interest rates, okay? But at the same time, there is so much debt that the government has that we know they're going to have to print. Well, we're told they might have to print.
Yeah.
So they've got these two opposing forces. And if in the great financial crisis, you're going to correct me on this, but whether it's debt or printing, whatever the cost was to get out of the great financial crisis in 2008, it was less than $1 trillion, we understand. This year, there's trillions of new debt. What happens in the next one? Do they have to go to Congress and they need 10 trillion or 15 trillion?
So here's the interesting thing. When I did my big study of different schools of economic thought after the 2008 financial crisis, I looked at the entire range. Mm-hmm. Okay, and the modern monetary theory, that it was starting to become vogue in the academic circles back then. It's being implemented now, but back then it was relatively a niche thing. And it's the polar opposite of the Austrian school. Modern monetary theory says debt and deficits don't matter. I'm oversimplifying, but Austrian school says capital structure is the only thing that matters. Okay, so they're the polar opposite. And it wasn't until I got into the Austrian school that light bulbs started going off. I don't think they're perfect, and a lot of folks who would be listening to this podcast who have an economics background are laughing. The Austrian school, that's been completely eradicated and has no credibility because they keep screaming hyperinflation and it never happens. Okay, but what's more interesting to me is why. If I think they're fundamentally right, which they are, which is that the capital structure really matters, and there will come a point at which it's the only thing that matters, why have they missed it so badly in their application of that theory by continually calling for a collapse of fiat currencies, and it continually doesn't happen? That's the more interesting question.
But does it need it? So if you're calling for hyperinflation, well, firstly, hyperinflation has happened. It just hasn't happened in
not in developed countries yet.
Yeah, I think the most developed country with close hyperinflation would be Turkey. What's the number that is it over 50%?
I don't even know what they consider hyperinflation. But
I mean, they're 97%, I think, anyway. I mean, that's catastrophic inflation.
It is catastrophic.
And we know, we don't have to repeat all the countries that have had hyperinflation these last couple of decades, but it has happened.
Sure.
But so when you said to me there's the school of thought, the MMT's thought that says, debt and what is it? Debt and
deficits.
Yes, it doesn't matter. Yeah. I think that is a small group of people saying that doesn't matter for a country, and I think the Austrians, their school of thought thinks of the individual. Yeah, it thinks of you as the individual. Capital structure.
That's definitely true. Yeah.
These people can make a decision for a collective, and the Austrians are making a decision for the individual. So I prefer the Austrians because I prefer to be the master of my own destiny.
Correct.
Right? But I do have some sympathy for at times of crisis that, if a country is in crisis, there is an opportunity to issue debt and, protect everyone.
Well, that's what Keynes originally had said.
Yes.
I think Keynes would not be happy about the bastardization of Keynesianism because it was supposed to be counter-cyclical. You weren't supposed to be stimulating with fiscal policy during boom times. It was only during the bust that you were supposed to stimulate, right?
But you can rob more during that period.
But that's the point, right? And so what happened is the economists became sort of the courtesans that the politicians would keep around them to justify the incredible deficit spending that they wanted to have. There is zero discipline in Congress. I laugh at the new Speaker of the House in the United States trying to get some control over this because most of the Republicans are big deficit spenders too. There is a so-called uniparty in Washington D.C. that they've all bought into this notion that deficits don't matter. I mean, that phrase was a phrase coined by Dick Cheney. So this is not a liberal versus conservative thing. I mean, hell, look at the debt numbers and tell me when you had a Democrat as president of the United States and when you had a Republican. Okay, the only time the debt dipped was when a Democrat was president of the United States. We just talked about this, right? So the Republicans are not actually walking the talk, so to speak.
I don't think the lack of hyperinflation invalidates their theory. What I care about is what is the overall impact in society. I think you can have a fracture in society without hyperinflation. You can have a widening wealth gap, which we definitely have a widening wealth gap.
Yeah, of course, and it's tragic.
I don't want hyperinflation to be the signal that says, oh, we were proved right. Let's just look at what's happening in the world. What is the size? Probably the better measure would be the size of the middle class. If the middle class
Absolutely.
is shrinking,
Yes.
then MMT...
Then the country's failing.
Yeah, the country's failing.
Yeah.
And middle classes are shrinking.
Yeah, because MMT is manipulating. It is creating a subtle way where wealth is being drained from the middle class to the upper classes and to the poorer classes. And it's doing it subtly. And a lot of people, they can't put their finger on exactly what's happening. I know the plumbing of how it's happening, but it's absolutely true that the rich are getting richer, the poor are doing relatively better, but the middle class is the one that's having their wealth drained. Absolutely. But to get back to your question of and this is the James Lavish tweet, will we end up with a debt tsunami? Of course we will. So he and I are not disagreeing about that. But one of the interesting things, and this is why one of the things the Austrians missed, is by the Fed printing money, it doesn't mean that is immediately inflationary as I define inflation here, to mean that it's going to cause a collapse of the currency immediately. Here's what's happening. The private financial sector created a lot of debt that is defaulting, and the public financial sector, i.e. the central bank, is just backfilling the bathtub. Okay, so when a default happens, that's deflationary. That money got destroyed. So what's happening is private money is getting destroyed and it's getting replaced with public money from the central bank's balance sheet. So if you look at private non-financial sector debt, it's been a while since I've looked at the Fed's Z1, but it's something around 95 trillion. Okay, so I don't even know what the Fed's balance sheet is. I haven't paid that much attention to it, but long story short, it's not even close to 95 trillion. So literally, if the entire private sector debt were to default, and the public sector debt was going to replace it, i.e. the Fed was going to expand its balance sheet to replace it just to keep the total amount of credit in the economy flat, the Fed could have a $95 trillion balance sheet. And we're not there yet. Okay, but see, this is why why I phrased it as one of the most interesting questions is why hasn't the dollar collapsed yet? Because the Austrians will scream, and they did at the time, the moment that the US went off the gold standard, dollar collapse, and it hasn't happened. Why? Because we were bequeathed a tremendous balance sheet by our ancestors. And we had an equity-financed economy up until 1968 in the United States. And frankly, most of the rest of the world, because most of the rest of the world follows the dollar and follows the US standard, whether explicitly or implicitly. And so, it used to be that your grandfather gifted you a Series EE savings bond in the 1950s. Now your grandparents are co-signing on your credit card. Okay, so we went from, when you come of age, we went from from being gifted assets to being gifted debt, and that's what's happening. And it's just now part of everybody's capital structure. But the erosion of real wealth that is coming from that is staggering. But it's been subtle, and it's been happening over 50 years. Literally, I was born in 1969, and the U.S. flipped from an equity-based economy to a debt-financed economy in 1968. So my entire life has been during where we've been eating the seed corn, so to speak. We've been drawing down the equity of the United States. But that's why those who called for a collapse of the dollar when the U.S. went off the gold standard in 1971 were wrong, because we actually had a lot of equity capital that we could just draw down. And we've been drawing it down by borrowing. And we will hit an insolvency in the U.S. at some point. So James is right. There is going to be a debt tsunami that is going to hit the insolvency at some point. But I think we're nowhere near as the naysayers think we are. Now, that said, it could happen tomorrow because the financial system is that unstable.
Wow.
And so, we could have another 2008 and have a systemic issue that requires, tens of trillions of dollars of printing by the Fed just to backfill for the default of private sector credit creation at that time. And I think we all know intuitively it's coming, but it's just not as close as most people think. Now, what my mentor, if he's listening, Jeff, I'm sure you're cringing as I'm talking about this, because he thinks it's happening tomorrow. And
literally tomorrow, he's every next day.
Yes, and it's so interesting is in the beginning he was a gold bug. And he was somebody who really helped me understand the Austrian school in application and what went wrong with it. But so he hated Bitcoin in the beginning, just hated it. Mm-hmm. And then a few of us were able to orange pill him. And now he's, he actually, this is going to sound a bit strange, but he's a deeply religious person. He thinks Bitcoin was divinely sent. And we don't know who Satoshi is because it was just one of the miracles of life. And I respect that, and I love that he thinks that, because he might be right. But the point is that's how far he's gone down the orange pill rabbit hole. Right?
Yeah,
Yep,
I love that.
100%. Right? And I don't think he sold all of his gold, but he's definitely a real assets kind of guy, and understands that this is the fallback. And he's absolutely right. Bitcoin is the fallback, and a lot of folks own it for that reason, that it's insurance against the collapse of the system. But if we could step back, why am I building a bank in the middle of all of that conversation that I just laid out? Well, you can see where I'm coming out on this. I don't think the banking system is stable, but I also don't think it's going away tomorrow.